Good afternoon. I know I stand between you and your lunch, and we're running late. And I will try to feed you a little bit here, and then you can go and get fed here when we are done with our morning, now well into the afternoon session. How many of you were here last night when Jermaine and the others were doing We Are the World? Raise your hand if you were here last night. Okay, because I want to take off from that. And some of you heard also Prime Minister Zapatero yesterday, also, who was here. Because last night was a kind of moment of hope in this organization. The Institute for Cultural Diplomacy is an organization about hope and possibility. And as we celebrate in Berlin this weekend, the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall, many people think this is a symbol of the new world we live in, a world potentially at least without walls. The other conference I'm at this weekend, in fact, is called Falling Walls. And the Falling Walls Conference is, at the same time this group is meeting, is celebrating the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall. And in many ways, that fall was meant to signal the end of a bipolar nuclear world in which the threat of nuclear holocaust was permanently in front of us. Last night, Prime Minister Zapatero, who I met before he became Prime Minister in Spain many years ago, his coming into the Prime Ministership in Spain was, for many people, a sign of Spain's fundamental change. That was before the Madrid train station was blown up, before he then was succeeded in office by others. As some of you know that Wolf Biermann, the great Eastern German folk singer, the Bob Dylan of East Germany, is here this weekend in Berlin. I had breakfast with him this morning. He sang last night at a special gathering that Angela Merkel was at, and Friday he sang in the Bundestag. Here was the kind of Bob Dylan of East Germany singing in the Bundestag today. So these are days now that seem full of hope. Just 5 years ago, we saw the second election of Obama into office, and just a few years ago, the Arab Spring, which all of us greeted with such hope for fundamental changes. And then last night, we heard Jermaine and all of you singing We Are the World. Well, back in the 70s, an American comic once said, the trouble with progressives and people who live in world peace is that, as he put it, our enemies win all the battles, but we have all the good songs. And I think that's true of the progressive movement. We have wonderful, wonderful songs going all the way back, but very often we lose the battles. Those who watched the American elections just in this previous week know that the forces that believe in internationalism, that believe in battling climate change, that believe in social and cultural equality, were deeply defeated, powerfully defeated in almost every state of the United States. And in the next 2 years, I will guarantee you, you will see from the United States no leadership whatsoever on any of the issues we care about. That's a promise or a threat, but it's a truth either way. The reality is, in other words, 25 years after the fall of the wall, we live in a world not of falling walls, but of rising walls. We live in a world where the walls between Sunni and Shiites, a world where the walls between Democrats and Republicans or Tories and socialists are higher than ever, where Europe, even as it lowers the walls inside Europe, has said to Turkey and others, we don't want Muslims part of Europe. Turkey can go somewhere else, and now Turkey has gone somewhere else, and Europeans are wondering what happened. Why did Turkey go away, as it were? It went away because Europe said, not interested, and built a new wall around Europe as high as the wall once was within Europe, between France and Germany, and between Italy and Austria. So there are new walls going up. We've watched the Arab Spring go straight to winter, hardly ever having found a summer. And the forces of military dictatorship in Egypt, Mubarak, succeeded briefly by a secular revolution and then by a legitimately elected president who happened, however, to be from the Muslim Brotherhood. And then the overthrow by force of that democratically elected president, like him or not, he was the one who was elected, by seculars who then watched new military forces far more vicious and dictatorial than Mubarak come into power. And if you don't think so, if you think al-Sisi's a good guy, look at what he just did with NGOs in Egypt, with civil society in Egypt. He basically outlawed and banned civil society, the very thing that we all believe in, the very soft forms of governments that we work with. Look at Libya, where we overthrew a dictator. I warned then that other forces were afoot. Today, the American ambassador has been killed. Libya is no longer a state. It's involved in tribal warfare, a civil war between Benghazi and Tripoli. Westerners are no longer safe there. 2 days ago, the Supreme Court, such as it is, of Libya declared the parliament illegitimate. As it was doing that, Sufi mosques continue to be burned with the Supreme Court doing nothing about it. I mention these details simply to say that while we aspire, all of us here, to peacemaking, and the Vice Chancellor from Malaysia we just heard, and the celebration next year that we heard about of the Magna Carta, 800 years since Runnymede, those are beautiful words, but the realities when you pick up the paper Monday morning are grim, are difficult. And what bothers me most is that that is a world in which the primary carriers of democracy and the primary political entities we turn to solve our problems, nation states, are increasingly dysfunctional, paralyzed, and unable to deal, either one by one or in bodies like the United Nations, unable to deal with the problems they face, whether it's climate change, where for now 22, 23 years since the Kyoto process, the COPS process in the UN started in Rio back in 1992, have done nothing as the temperatures go up and the oceans rise. Year after year after year, meeting, proclaiming noble sentiments, but explaining that their sovereignty doesn't permit them to act, and then going home again. The United States and China, between them, 40% of carbon emissions. The United States, in this new Congress, you watch the horrendous tar sands pipelines, and tar sands is the worst possible form of oil. It's a natural disaster for the landscape. It's a natural disaster for the atmosphere. The XL pipeline will now be approved, and that horrendous oil will go through the United States, down to ports, and exported probably over to Europe and other places around the world. So the walls aren't coming down, my friends, they're going up. Things are not getting better, they are getting worse, and the entities that for 400 years have been the conservators of democracy and the political problem solvers we turn to are nation states, independent, democratic, but bordered and sovereign and unwilling and unable to cooperate despite the United Nations, or some would say because of the disunited nations, are of little hope or potential. Now, I can stop there and we can go to lunch, but we'll be very depressed if I do that. So let me do part two, because there is, thank God, a part two. I want to suggest that we have been looking for the last 10 or 15 years at the wrong political institutions for problem solving, for democracy, for dealing with climate change, for hope. We've been looking at states, nation states, bordered, sovereign, independent, uncooperative, competitive. I want to suggest instead we start looking at cities. We've been talking about prime ministers and presidents. Some of them are here. I want to suggest we stop thinking about presidents and prime ministers and start thinking about mayors. We've been talking about citizens as those passive, television-watching folks who don't really believe in democracy anymore. And by the way, the horrendous election results last week in the United States were the result of about 1 out of 4 eligible voters voting. 3 out of 4 of the people who had a right to vote didn't vote. In other parts of the world, people are fighting and giving up their lives to get the vote. We've had it for 200 years, and 3/4 of our citizens don't use it, and the ones who don't use it are those who need it most. You might ask yourself, how in a new American republic, which is increasingly multicultural, urban, young, single women, women working, how can it be that the most reactionary party of old white men who look like me, they don't think like me, unfortunately, but they look like me, how is it that they keep winning elections? Because people like me vote. 4 out of 5 people who look like me vote. 1 out of 5 people who are young, female, and black or Latino vote. So this is not a democracy any longer in the United States. It is a tyranny of a committed minority of aging white men and women, but mostly men. Less than 3 out of 10 white men voted for Obama, for example. He won the election because in the presidential elections, the votes go up, and in the off-year elections, they don't. So around the world, a minority continue to dominate. They're the ones who run the carbon corporations, BP, Shell, Chevron. They're the ones who mine for coal in Poland and Russia, Australia and the United States, China, where so much of energy is coal. We talk about converting automobiles to electric vehicles, but if the electricity is being generated by coal, that's not an improvement in climate change. So that level of government has failed us, and I suggest we stop depending on it and move to look at those who don't fail us. Look at what's happening in our cities in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in China, in India, in Latin America, where Bogota, Medellin, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City, in Asia, where Seoul and Jakarta and Yokohama are run by mayors who care deeply about climate change, who care deeply about issues of immigration, who care deeply about issues of religious intolerance, and take measures, because they are mayors and they have to, who take measures to deal with it, meaningful measures. If you look at trust levels around the world, most citizens in democratic nations no longer trust their national governments. That's true in France and England. It's true in Denmark. It's true in Italy, Spain. Certainly true in the United States. People don't trust their national governors even though they elect them. In the United States, the Congress we just elected, again, 1 out of 10 Americans trust the Congress. 9 out of 10 Americans say, we don't trust the Congress we just elected. But now ask, do you trust your mayor? Do you trust your city manager? Do you trust your city councilor? 70 to 80% of people around the world say yes. We trust our local mayors because that's a neighbor in power. The city council is somebody who lives down the block. City managers from my neighborhood. Mayors are, in the American parlance, homeboys, homies, homeboys and homegirls. They're from the neighborhood. You can't be from somewhere else and run for mayor. Bobby Kennedy came from Massachusetts and ran for senator from New York. Mrs. Clinton came from Arkansas and ran for senator from New York. But you better be from New York City, where I was born and raised, if you want to run for mayor. Because you can't parachute in anywhere and become mayor. Because mayors are from their towns. Cities are different than states. Cities are the original human communities, towns, the polis. That's where we come from. When you ask people where they're from, they might say Japan if they're traveling, but they're more likely to say Yokohama or Kyoto or Tokyo. And if you ask me where I'm from, I might say, well, I'm an American, I'm from the US, but I'll probably say I'm from New York, the Upper West Side. And ask someone in Berlin where they come from, and not just Kennedy, you said, ich bin ein Berliner. The Berliners will say, I'm a Berliner, or I'm from Leipzig, or Dresden, or Hamburg. Wolf Biermann now, he was in East Germany, now he's living in Hamburg. He said to me this morning, I said, are you living in Berlin? No, ich bin Hamburger. He's up with Olaf Scholz, the mayor, and he knows the mayor of Hamburg very well, because the mayor knows the local interesting cultural celebrities in their midst. Cities identify us. Cities are what we are about. Some of you know that last year and the year before, the United States government closed its doors twice. 2 times. Once for a week and once for 10 days. And what's extraordinary is nobody noticed. But imagine closing Berlin or London or Louisville or Tokyo. You can't close a city. No police, no garbage collection, no subways, no buses, no hospitals, no schools. No way to close a city. Cities in the Middle Ages during war and plague weren't closed, and they're not closed today. Sarajevo during the siege and the difficulties of the 1990s wasn't closed. You can't close cities because that's where people live. It's where they're born, where they grow up, educated, married, where they work, where they pray, and where they play, where they grow old, and where they die. Cities are us. We are not the world, as the song has it. Cities are the world. Because it's in cities and towns that the we of community is engendered. Cities are about public space. We always think of the countryside as the open spaces, but the open spaces of the countryside are private. In the city, we talk about public spaces. The former mayor of Rome was here this morning. He told me he renewed 180 public squares in Rome in the end of the 1990s when he was mayor, because he saw those public spaces as the essence of the city, open public spaces where we meet in public together. So why not think about looking at cities, which, by the way, are now today 52% of the world's population and 75% of the Western population, the developed world's population. Why not look at cities that control and generate 80% of GDP, gross domestic product? Why not look at cities that actually generate the majority of the carbon emissions we need to control? Why not look at cities that are 90% on water and suffer from rising oceans and seas more than any other place first, as we learned in New York last year and as New Orleans, and cities in Bangladesh and Indonesia have learned long ago? It's cities that will be the first victims of ocean rise. It's cities that are the first victims of drought. Not just in Africa and Asia, but there's drought now in the South. The worst drought in history in the southwestern states of the United States, directly connected with climate change, which about half of America still denies is happening, even as they can't find water to drink in Houston. So I want to suggest that we need to look at cities again as problem solvers, but not one by one, because we live in a global world. Here's, in fact, the problem with nation states. Think about the world we live in. Every problem, every challenge we face today is a challenge of interdependence, a cross-border challenge. Climate change. There's no Berlin warming, no German warming, no European warming. It's global warming. The new technologies. There's no Hamburg web, Brussels web. It's the World Wide Web. Ebola started in Liberia and Sierra Leone, but within a few weeks with modern transportation, it was moving around the world. HIV doesn't carry a passport. It goes where it will. And the new diseases spread so quickly around the world that we have global pandemics so that national health systems can't do anything about it. And think about markets. The financial markets that collapsed in a few banks in England and America in 2007 and 2008 caused within a few months a global meltdown financially that we're still dealing with, particularly here in Europe and in Japan. All over the world. It didn't matter. It wasn't an English bank or an American bank or a French bank or a Japanese bank. It was a global meltdown. The problems are interdependent. The so-called illegal immigration that has workers from the sub-Sahara going to Morocco and from Morocco into Spain and Spain throughout the European countries without a Schengen passport. The 12 million Latinos, mostly Mexicans, who have come across the border and now are in the United States with their families working, who are illegal. Labor follows the logic of a global economy, not the logic of 18th century sovereign states. So people go for where the jobs are, and they don't worry about whether they have passports. And you know who has to deal with that? Mayors, because those illegal immigrants are in the cities. And the smart mayors start taking action. Mayor Olaf Scholz of Hamburg has started issuing urban visas to so-called illegal immigrants as long as they register with the police and they obey the law. Their kids can go to school. In California, the cities have given driver's licenses to illegal immigrants because better have them drive with a license than without a license if they're there. Mayors are realists. The immigrants are there. They live there. Their kids go to school. They use the hospitals. We pretend they're invisible. The nation states threaten to throw them out if they find them and then cover their eyes because they don't want to find them and they don't want to deal with it because they know their economic value. Cities are straightforward and honest. They're there. Let's deal with them. Let's make this real. Give them the privileges and rights and obligations of residents and citizens. So in a world of interdependent cross-border challenges, we are still depending on 18th century independent sovereign states that think they have jurisdiction over everything, when they have jurisdiction over almost nothing. The most powerful country in the world, economically, militarily, the United States of America, can't control jobs where they go, industries, immigrants, warming, disease, or anything else. You saw the foolish panic that said in the United States, when the threat of Ebola, which is a serious problem in East Africa, not a problem at all in the United States, but you saw the panic. And that was a panic about loss of control. Because Americans, like so many people, think we can control things. We're Americans, we know how to deal with it, but nobody can control by themselves the global challenges we face. For that, we need global democratic institutions, and the only ones we have are rooted in nation states. State-based institutions like the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the United Nations. Those are the institutions we depend on, and we watch them fail over and over again, not for lack of good intentions, but because the nation states that constitute them and comprise them are unable to agree with one another on almost anything. We need a different mechanism. I say start with the cities. Start with the mayors. Create a global institution of mayors. I don't believe Israel and Palestine anytime soon will solve their problems, but it's not impossible that Tel Aviv and Ramallah can figure out they have common interests and common problems and deal with those issues together. I don't think the East and West Ukraine and Russia and the West are going to do very much that's useful or productive in the Ukraine, but I believe that Kiev and Moscow and their two mayors can probably make a lot of progress on doing things and working together. And if you have a global parliament of mayors, if you actually convene the mayors of the world regularly in the way that we convene the United Nations and ask them, can you work together? I guarantee you they will say yes. I can guarantee it because they're already doing it. There are dozens of intercity networks and associations already at work on many different things, including climate change. ICLE, the Environmental Issues Group, has been around for 25 or 30 years. The C40, that a mayor started, two mayors, the mayor of Toronto and the mayor of New York, C40 climate cities. Now 68 major global cities working together on climate change. The most important organization in the world nobody's ever heard of, the UCLG. Who's heard of the UCLG? United Cities and Local Governments. It's 100 years old. Been here since World War I, converges two 19th century city organizations. It meets quietly every year and tries to figure out how cities can cooperate together. There are dozens of such inner-city associations, and they make a kind of arch of governance, but there's no keystone. You know, when you build an arch, you need a keystone in the top, otherwise they keep falling down, the pieces you put up to build an arch. You have to have a keystone. A mayor's parliament. Let mayors rule. Create a mayor's parliament, which becomes a keystone that holds the arch of intercity cooperation up. Let them start to take on the tough problems of immigration, the tough problems of technology sharing, the tough problems of climate change, and yes, even so-called national security. Quick story here. After 9/11, Mayor Giuliani, then the mayor of New York, sent the intelligence squad that was working on terrorism and protecting New York to Washington to join Homeland Security. And 2 years later, they came back and said, we're not getting any cooperation in Washington. We're learning nothing. And Mike Bloomberg, who was then the mayor, said, okay, let's do it differently. Let's dispatch the New York intelligence squad to Rio and Jakarta and Frankfurt and London and Moscow. Let's do city-to-city intelligence sharing, because intelligence is the new frontier in modern asymmetrical war. You know, we had the most powerful Navy and Air Force and Army in the world, and it didn't help us at all in 9/11, right? Because that was people inside the country, not outside the country. Intelligence sharing is critical. So even in security issues, cities working together can sometimes do things that nations don't do very well. So a global parliament of mayors offers us a way forward, a way in which we reclaim democracy, a way in which the trust of voters and citizens really still is there for the people. All the young people who aren't voting, all the people of color who in the West, and Muslims in Holland, and young blacks in America who don't vote because they think democracy doesn't work. We show them it does work in the cities, and they see that, and their participation rates go up, because that's where they can believe in democracy. A parliament of cities can become the source of new aspirational hope, the source of new possibilities for democracy, but most importantly, the hope that this organization, cultural diplomacy, and the peace organizations in the Malaysian university where they teach peacekeeping, it can give them political hope. Because here's the problem, and I'll close with this. The problem is this. Those of us who care about peace and justice and equality, we have great songs, absolutely great songs. Thank you, Jackson 5. Thank you, Wolf Biermann. Thank you, Bob Dylan. But we continue to lose the hard political battles because we're not organized politically. We've got the soft cultural influence, but we haven't yet figured out how to get the hard political power. And until hard political power is on the side of justice and equality, we will continue to lose the battles. And I want to suggest that when you take the political power, the economic power of cities, and put them together, you will have a hard political force capable of bringing real muscle, political muscle, to the tough issues of climate change, global markets, global technology, global disease, global terrorism. You will have forces that actually can make a difference and can put muscles on the wonderful bones of cultural diplomacy and actually reach political solutions that work, because cities do generate 80% of global wealth, and they do represent over half the world's population. And they are in a position to solve real problems, and when they do it together across borders, to solve global problems and kindle, again, hope for democracy. Wouldn't it be wonderful if some of the young people who come to the Institute on Cultural Diplomacy to gain a little hope in a pessimistic world could find that hope in any city they lived in, because they believe that their city could make the difference. A parliament of mayors, the power of cities is there for us to transform the world democratically and create a future in which sustainable development and true equality and justice are possible, not just in the lyrics of beautiful songs, but in the real politics of the world. Thank you very much.